For my presentation, I'm going to talk about the EU's relationship with Ukraine. So what are the essentials to know? Ukraine has always been in a sort of perilous position between Russia and the rest of Europe because it's quite literally situated between the two. And its name actually derives from the Slavic term for borderland, which is pretty apt. Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union for 70 years and has gone through two major revolutions since independence, the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan. Ukraine is not an official country for accession to the EU. It's not a candidate country. However, it is a part of the EU's Eastern Partnership, along with other former Soviet nations such as Georgia and Moldova. And Ukraine remains destabilized to this day as a result of Russian-backed interference in the Donbass region and annexation of Crimea to Russia. In 2019, Ukraine elected Volodymyr Zelensky as its current president as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, geography plays a big role in politics in Ukraine, and it is a very divided nation in all senses of the notion. Basically, in the north and in the west, there's a Ukrainian majority who is ethnic Ukrainian and speaks Ukrainian, whereas in the south and the east, there's a Russian ethnic majority who primarily speaks Russian, and that divides the country in loyalties between wanting to integrate further with the West and Europe and wanting to remain allied with Russia, and more of a modern day alliance of former Soviet and communist nations. And so it does border EU countries, notably Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia, and it also does border countries that are allied with Russia, such as Belarus. And as you'll see in the maps that I'm about to show, the divisions are pretty stark. As you can see, there tends to be a sharp divide between where people vote for pro-European politicians and pro-Ukrainian politicians versus pro-Russian politicians and people who are more opposed to integration with the EU. And these are from the Washington Post, and they reflect election maps and language and ethnic distribution in Ukraine. So, as we also talked about in class, Ukraine is important into the whole of Europe because a lot of gas pipelines cut through Ukraine, and they service countries such as Germany, France, Italy, who get their natural gas for heat and other uses from Russia. And so a lot of those pipelines pass through Ukraine, and so Ukraine is strategically important not only to Russia, but also to Europe. So a brief history is that Ukraine was briefly independent after World War I around that period in 1918, but then it was quickly absorbed into the Soviet Union by 1921 and remained so for 70 years until 1991 when they became independent once again. Ukraine had an early revolution in the 2000s called the Orange Revolution, and that came as a result of a very similar situation to the Euromaidan, where you had Viktor Yushchenko, who was favored for wanting to seek integration with Europe and with the ethnic Ukrainian population, versus Viktor Yanukovych, who will come more into play with the Euromaidan as well, who was more favored by the Russian population, a Moscow favorite. And Viktor Yushchenko was also poisoned at one point, but that's kind of a separate thing. But basically, it was a thing where it was early signs of a rift in a newly independent Ukraine, and Ukraine also has a marred history with Russia in terms of the Holodomor famine in the 1930s and the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. And it's understandable how Ukrainians have developed distrust towards Russians over the years, especially as Russian dominance is a factor in their history. And so you have the Euromaidan emerge in late 2013 or early 2014 when the president at the time, who was Viktor Yanukovych, who was mentioned earlier, he decided to abandon an association agreement with the EU in November 2013, bowing to Russian pressure and wanting to stay more aligned with Russia, but that did not sit well with many Ukrainians. And as a result, and wanting to be more integrated with Europe and wanting to have closer ties with the EU, they decided to hold massive protests in the heart of winter in Kiev's Independence Square, the Maidan. And so they toughed out really cold weather for months and really bad conditions. And it all came to a head when in late February of 2014, around 100 protesters died as a result of aggression by police tied to the president and just the government in charge. And so that was the bloodiest day of the revolution. And as a result, people got very angry with the president very quickly, and things spiraled from there. And as a result, President Yanukovych fled the country to Russia, to safety there, and basically left for a new government to form. And it was a pro-Western government, and they wanted further integration with the EU. And as a result, eventually Petro Poroshenko got elected president. But Russia, this didn't sit well with Russia because they basically saw it as sort of a coup. And as a result, a destabilization process emerges in Ukraine, such as when the Donbass region there's militias that are pro-Russian and they're sponsored or they're aided by Russia in backing. And they take over Donetsk and Lugansk. And then you've got the Russian annexation of Crimea, which is seen as a breach of international law. And then there's when Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 was shot out of the sky, and obviously a ballistic missile. Obviously, it's Russians involved, and you have innocent passengers transiting through who are killed, and it makes the EU and its allies put pressure on the Russians by imposing sanctions over misdeeds by the Russians. And as a result of all these chaos going on, you have a meeting in 2015 between Germany's Angela Merkel, Russia's Vladimir Putin, Ukraine's Petro Poroshenko, and France's François Hollande in Minsk in Belarus to try and sort out the conflict and put a cease to hostilities and try and improve the situation because it had become quite volatile. Thousands of people had died. And so eventually Ukraine kind of gets back more on track with it wanting to sign the association agreement with the EU, and that happens. But it's understandable that Ukraine's not going to join the EU right away. There was rapid expansion in 2004, 2005, and 2007 with many former communist countries in the Warsaw Pact deciding to join the EU and being allowed to become full-fledged members, such as the Baltic nations. But as we've seen from our lectures in class and in general in the news, countries like Poland and Hungary have backslid, and they've become increasingly, and the EU has become increasingly aware of the downfalls of rapid expansion as well. And so it's more wary to admit new members without properly getting them to a place where their membership would not pose as many problems. And so you have all of these things going on, and Ukraine is still trying to become more integrated with Europe, but there's the tension with Russia. And so Ukraine has adopted measures to try and get it more in line. It has adopted anti-discrimination policies in line with the EU. In 2017, Ukraine was granted visa-free travel to the European Union Schengen area, but they still need to obtain work permits if they actually want to work there, but still it's a step towards further integration. Still, Ukraine faces problems like other Eastern Partnership members where they have to meet the Copenhagen criteria, but the EU has taken steps to help fund Ukraine's development and make it a place, and kind of get it in a place where it would eventually, maybe years from now, be in a place to potentially join. And with joining often comes as well NATO membership. And that is a problem because Russia is very wary of NATO membership and encroachment of the EU and NATO on its external borders to the west. And there's a lot of other factors too. President Zelensky, the current president, has worked to forge closer ties with European leaders. But again, it's being a former Soviet state. Ukraine has many issues with corruption that probably won't be solved anytime soon. And it has a ways to go, but it's an interesting country to see how its revolution galvanized people to go out into the streets because they were very ardent about they want to be closer with Europe and they see the values of being a part of the EU. And it'll take a lot of work to get to a place where membership is even possible, but people don't want to be aligned with the past. They want to look to the future, and they see a future with the EU. They see economic opportunities with the EU. They see advancement with the EU. They see a more just society with the EU. And it goes to show the value of the EU and how people want to be a part of it despite its flaws. And they're willing to even go to a revolution for it. And they want to fight for it. And they'll fight against a power like Russia for it. And it just goes to show the power of the EU and the opportunities it presents. And so with that, I have my citations page as well. And I hope you enjoyed my presentation. And I will also send along the physical PowerPoint as well for you to look at it further. Thank you. And that's it.